Thank you all for joining. It seems our group is growing, so I'm really pleased to see that. Today, as you know, this is the third meeting of Shakespeare for Today, and we will focus specifically on Hamlet and the banality of evil, or the evil of just doing one's job. My student facilitator today is Leah Anasato. She's actually a junior English major and a student athlete, and she will take us through a close and cross-historical reading of one scene from Shakespeare's Hamlet, and I will do the really difficult work of reading the very short lines of Horatio that kind of, in some ways, punctuate or give us a pause between the more extensive reflections of Hamlet. But just for those of you who are unable to read the description, that gives us a bit of a context for the reading that Leah will be engaged in. I'll read that first, and then I will turn it over to Leah, and I will try as smoothly as possible to put up to share the actual text. So with that, as some of you might recognize, this month's title is taken from Hannah Arendt's 1961 report on the trial of Adolph Eichmann, one of the main architects of the Holocaust. Over the course of her examination of this man at the center of one of the greatest crimes against humanity, she can't help but register that he was nothing like a monster of the psychopathic variety. In fact, what struck her most about him, and presumably the many others he represented or continues for us to represent, is the extent to which he came off as a thoroughly ordinary, thoughtless bureaucrat just doing his job. That way, for Arendt, Eichmann possessed nothing like the complex motives of a Shakespearean villain. In other words, as she insists, he was not Iago and not Macbeth, and nothing would have been farther from his mind than to determine with Richard III to prove a villain. What Arendt misses, and by contrast what this month's gathering will explore, is that the banality of Eichmann's evil, characterized as it was by the sheer thoughtlessness that predisposed him to become one of the greatest criminals of the 20th century, can actually and ironically be traced to Shakespeare's most thoughtful character, Hamlet. In short, it is only after Hamlet figures out how to convert the difficult moral ethical questions about militarism and revenge into a series of bureaucratic tasks that he can thoughtlessly propel himself into the play's concluding bloodbath. So in the process of close reading this pivotal moment in the play, we, specifically Leah, will think about how bureaucracies, oppressive institutional structures, and mind-numbing procedures affect our capacity to think deeply and act ethically. And as always, we will do our best to imagine ways of protecting those thoughts and actions from today's banalities of bureaucratic evil. So with that, I'll turn it over to Leah. Give me a second to share my screen with you.
Well, he does that. I just want to say thank you so much for being here today. I'm excited to share and discuss with everybody.
Let's see, roughly here you are. I think this should be it. All right. Okay. Let's see.
Okay. Hamlet. Sir, in my heart there was a kind of fighting that would not let me sleep. I want us to first of all notice here that there's an immediate focus on heart and feeling, and that he's going through some moral distress that's distracting him. Methought I lay worse than the mutines and the bilboes. And just as a note, the mutines and the bilboes means that he was chained. He felt like he was chained together like prisoners. Just more this distress that's kind of tearing at him. Rashly, and praised be rashness for it. This is also one of the crucial points of today's reading, this part of rashly, this thought of not acting, not thinking through, but just acting before, not thinking through what his distraction is, but finding a way to act through it. And it's a question of how does he handle that distraction? Let us know our indiscretion sometimes serves us well, when our dear plots do pall. So instead of plotting or scheming, just acting. And that should teach us there's a divinity that shapes our ends. And this is also important. We're shifting the blame. So we're not going to take on the blame or responsibility for our actions. We're just going to act because divinity, something higher up, is an ultimate control. And so that there's a sense of being heaven ordained that justifies thoughtlessness. Rough hew them how we will. So it doesn't matter what we do. It doesn't matter how we mess up. Ultimately, the actions are ordained by heaven, so we aren't to blame. Up from my cabin, my sea gown scarfed about me in the dark, groping eye to find out, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, had my desire, fingered their packet. And packet's the first indication of paperwork, letters, a commission, and that's so much of our world today. And in fine, withdrew to my own room again, making so bold, my fears forgetting manners. So his fears, his emotions are controlling him and making his actions, or controlling his actions, to unseal their grand commission. Now that's a sentence with so much going on. A seal is like a mark of legitimacy or authority. And so that's giving this commission its authority. And then there's this sense, this grand commission gives this idea that the commission or the command is full of awe and reverence, that these official papers have a lot of power and command to them. Where I found, Horatio, O royal knavery, an exact command, again, the command given from the higher ups, larded with many.
And so Leah, let me interrupt quickly. And it's like,
Yeah.
This is specifically a grand command from the king, that his uncle Claudius.
Larded with many several sorts of reasons, importing Denmark's health and England's too. So like this command, it has reasons, it has proofs, it's giving these grounds for following the command, but these reasons are really broad. Denmark's health, England's too. They're using bigger than you, bigger than life reasons and proofs as a way to, like a diplomatic relationship between the countries to back the command without actually giving what the command is or what the reasons behind the command is, but there's just these reasons behind that are proofing it. With Ho, once again, there's a sense of rush. Such bugs and goblins in my life. And this part is that he's seeing that these proofs are saying that he is a threat and that his life is creating danger and problems. And so that's why this command exists, and that's why he needs to, that there's such rush. So there's this sense of rush, mostly, the rashness with Ho, that on the supervised, this is just another word that kind of, makes you think of authority, looking down, observing, overseeing. No leisure baited, once again, rush. No, not to stay the grinding of the axe, even if it means to behead him with a dull axe. Don't take any time. Rush this. Get this done quickly. My head should be struck off.
It's possible.
Giving the commission to him. Here's the commission. Read it at thy leisure. But wilt thou hear me how I did proceed? So one thing I want to know is that here's the commission. There's obviously a lot of weight and importance in the commission. He's handing it to him as an answer to his question of, is this possible? And
I beseech you.
Being thus benetted around with villainies, ere I could make a prologue to my brains, they had begun the play. So before he could even think this through, before his brain was even going to consider everything going on, they had begun to act. He had acted out mindless completion of the task before reconsideration. I sat me down, devised a new commission, sending them to their deaths. Wrote it fair. There's so much emphasis on written commissions, devising, these written orders, not acting himself, but devising a new commission to, instead of being the one to commit the act of getting revenge, he's going to go through this process of writing out a new commission that delegates the action to other people for mindless completion of the task. I once did hold it, as our statists do, and statists statement, those who are educated, a baseness to write fair. So there's this disdain for this task, but also of the tasker, and like looking down at the process of writing as base, as the job of a clerk and skills of bureaucracy, but he's doing it. He's writing out this commission. He's using these delegation skills to get his job done. Labored much, how to forget that learning. But sir, now it did me a Yale man's surface. Wilt thou know the effect of what I wrote?
1 second, I'm sorry. I closed the window. Aye, good my lord.
An earnest conjuration from the king. Once again, there's this sense of higher up giving the order. So there's a lot of emphasis on the authority, on who is giving this order. The king, he's got a lot of power in him. As England was his faithful tributary, as love between them like the palm should flourish, as peace should still wheaten her garland wear, and stand a comma between their amities, and many such like ases of great charge. So we see a lot of flowery language, a lot of decoration to distract from the actual commission or the actual task, what the actual order of this commission is. Just all these flowery language distracting from the actual purpose to obscure, but at the same time back up and give proof or reason for his commission. That on the view and know of these contents, without debatement, further more or less, more rush, and also very pragmatic, legalistic language that's focused not on the task, but on just rushing through this, getting this done. He should the bearers put to sudden death, not striving time allowed. So many references to rushing, urgency, and this sense of urgency again aids in creating this circumstance or situation that dissuades the one who has been tasked from questioning or hesitating to carry it out, but to just do it because there's a lot of urgency around it and it's coming from so high up.
Mm-hmm. In that reference, no striving time allowed, interestingly brings us back to religion, right? No time for them to confess, right? How was it sealed?
That also seal, there's so much emphasis on the seal. Who gave the authority to that commission? Why, even that was heaven ordinate. So I have another instance where Hamlet, who he feels heaven ordained, he feels like what he is doing isn't on him, but it's on heaven, because heaven's giving all these reasons why he is in their favor. I had my father's signet in my purse, which was the model of the Danish seal. Folded the writ up in the form of the other, subscribed it, gave it the impression, placed it safely, the changeling never known. So many mindless little tasks, little completions of paperwork that give this commission its authority and its legitimacy and its power. He addresses it, he seals it, he places it safely, and then there's this changing never known. And I want us to think about this word changeling. There was there's folklore that gives this word changeling is when parents think that their child has been kidnapped and replaced by fairies who look like their children, because somehow their children seem so wrong. They seem like they're not who they're supposed to be. So there's this cover up. We just see that the surface and appearance is more important. This focus on how it looks and whether it's official looking more than the content. And there's this idea that the content isn't what the surface or the officiality of it is.
So Guildenstern and Rosencrantz go to their deaths.
Why, man, they did make love to their employment. They are not near my conscience. So once again, he doesn't feel responsible. He doesn't feel like this is anything. Putting them to death through all his flowery language and creating this commission is not on him because, one, he wasn't thinking it through. He was just mindlessly completing the tasks. We saw that, and then there's a sense of urgency, rush, not making sure that he didn't have time to think through it. And he feels like he's heaven ordained. He's given this all up to heaven. And this is in itself kind of ironic because he's completing a task. He's loving his employment to heaven in his point of view. And there's just like this continuous, that's where the lack of conscience comes from, this lack of sense of responsibility, and leads him to ordering the death of two school friends of his.
And what struck us about that is how, as Leah's been describing, is how that opportunity for it to work on his conscience is lost in the very clerkly bureaucratic processes. And so we wanted to think about to what extent do we struggle to balance this, an ethical understanding or orientation to the work we're doing, to the bureaucratic nature of what we're doing. So this is something that could apply specifically, or I guess most obviously and specifically to the fully fledged professionals in the audience, right? How do we balance that? How do we, is it possible for us to continue to be ethical, moral in our orientation to our work? Or is there a way in which the very bureaucratic nature of that work, in some ways, the busyness of the processes themselves work against that ethical orientation? I think just to kind of jump into the general conversation, I think that Michelle identified, just in terms of my artwork over my head, that is a problem in especially the early 16th century, where you have these scholars who are educated in terms of ethical public service, but then they're being forced to serve the bureaucratic needs of an ethically questionable monarch and ethically questionable monarchs in general. So I think it's a period-specific question that Hamlet exemplifies for us. That is the relationship between education as a bureaucratic skill, or education as something that should always be grounded or propelled by some sort of ethical orientation. But it resonates, in other words, so powerfully. I think it continues to resonate with our challenges as, let's say, highly educated, and I don't want to diminish, but let's say highly educated people tasked with very bureaucratic, complex tasks or responsibilities. So that is thank you very much for taking us through that, Leah. And so we're open to your reflections. So that's the example for, as I said, the fully fledged professionals. But I think for the students, it can resonate just in terms of your identities as students, as you're emerging into, let's say, more fully unqualified adulthood. That is balancing the work, that is the responsibility of being a student with the purpose. Is there a greater purpose that should or does a greater purpose propel you? That is the difference between getting a job or getting any job, or a job consistent with your beliefs. And I don't know if, Leah, you wanted to speak any more to that.
I think that it's easy for me personally to get lost in the details that don't matter, and because in a way it's easier to focus on structures or rules, and that makes it easy to distract you from what the actual purpose of those rules are. So in one kind of really broad, just like as an example, like just as an athlete, there are rules in my game, obviously. I play golf, but we have a lot of rules, and every year those rules are basically changed or kind of like adapted to that year. But there's always like this reasoning behind the rule, and there's always like a story that led to the creation of the rule. But sometimes it's easy to forget that there's like this purpose behind the rule, and then that the goal of the rule is to really focus on that purpose, not to just focus on the rule, but that there's like this point of the rule. And I think that when we focus on mindlessly completing the task, it's easy to just focus on the rule, the structure, not so much the purpose of those rules. And it's only when we realize the purpose of those rules that those rules really have any meaning. And then if we don't focus on the purpose of the rules could be completely not in line with the purpose, but we wouldn't realize it because we're just following the rules. And I think that that's something that we can see in our everyday life, not just in playing golf, but like there are so many rules that we have to live by. And there's a point where we have to question the purpose of those rules in society, in sports, in school. And I just think that that's something that growing up, my dad taught me to, but I didn't realize completely till I had to think of it through myself. So I just want us to kind of focus on that too.
Right. And what happens when we identify, I think implicit in what you were just saying, what happens when we identify that the rules are wrong, are bad, are in some ways negatively consequential in some ways? Then what are we left with? And I think because one of the things that Hamlet is identifying is that a way to avoid, that is to protect one's conscience, is to mystify it as some sort of divine purpose, right? That, in other words, to convert it into a religion of sorts, right? So what do we do once we identify, let's say, an ethical glitch in the rules? Do we just say, well, it is divinely so and so be it? Or is there? And I'm not pretending that I think that, or I want us all to run out and be the most radical subversive revolutionaries, because I think often it is the case when you identify that something is just wrong. There isn't necessarily much certainly built in within the system. There isn't much for us to do about it. So where does that leave us? And so I guess a more general way of presenting the question, what happens in the process of doing whatever our task is? What happens when we identify that, this isn't right, there's something wrong, that it's hurting, it might be hurting a person, or it might be hurting people hurting people in an obvious way, but I'm rendered powerless. What can I do? Because if I speak up, if I resist, however, it can be devastatingly consequential to me. And I don't expect everyone or any of us just to decide or to be able to just sacrifice themselves in that way. So I guess the question I'm asking is, where does that leave us emotionally, spiritually, psychologically? So who would like to jump in?
I think I was just watching a documentary on Netflix. It was about like one of the worst like child abuse cases ever, of a child who died at like 8 years old. His name was Gabriel. And it's like, it was a really long documentary. Like each episode was like an hour long, but it was insane. And it really talks about the issues in our social, our social worker system and stuff like that, and how some people, like even like a security guard at the desk of that building, had to do some social workers' jobs, like call other people because they're afraid of going ahead of other people just for the sake of a kid's life. Like seeing this kid walk in and seeing like cigarette like marks on his head, and he was like, this isn't right. And some he was pretty much doing other people's jobs because they're afraid they're going to get fired, when it's their job to call these people because they see marks on this kid. And he's like, what is wrong, like, with this system? And sometimes he was saying, I knew it wasn't right, like, that's not even my job, I'm a security guard, to go over these people's heads to do their job, but I knew I could get fired for stepping in their zone. But at the end of the day, I didn't want to risk, like, the next day hearing that kid was dead. But unfortunately, Gabriel did die at 8 years old. But he was like, there's no way I could have, like, he did get fired as a security guard because of this power structure in our government. And he said, he had to not testify in court, but he was like a witness in court because he saw, like, Gabriel at some point in his life to try and put his his mom's boyfriend in jail for killing Gabriel. And it was just like, that just reminds me of, I'm not supposed to do this, but I did it anyway, because sometimes in your gut, you feel like you have to break the rule to do the right thing, even though it may cost you your job or your life at some point, because sometimes you may feel like your job is worth more, or your job is not worth, like, that little boy's life was worth more than his job, he felt, so that kind of reminded me of that.
Yeah.
And those are hard decisions. He was just like, there's no way I could go home or, like, not make that call, kind of thing. And I feel like we've all kind of been put in that situation before. And those are, like, hard situations. Like, I don't think there's really, like, a definite answer, because like, what the outcome is. Like, he knew that he could be fired, but he also knew if he didn't make that call, like, what if he died, or what if he got beat up again by his parents or whatever, and also if none of this ever happened, if he never got fired, he wouldn't have the freedom to, like, fully exploit, like, the issues that are going on in our government system for the kids who are suffering, and they're not doing anything about it. They're, like, just hiding these kids so they don't get fired from their job, kind of thing, so maybe it happens for a reason, I guess.
Right. I was thinking as you were talking, is there, not for that security guard specifically,
Right.
but I'm really curious about the other people. And I think that the other people that you're identifying are the counselors, right? Who are
like the social workers.
The social workers, right? And so just in thinking in terms of Hamlet, in the way that he focuses on the bureaucratic detail of finding or stealing the commission, unsealing it, right? Reading it, assessing the writing of it, and then rewriting it, right? And is that attention to those processes. And then, just in case we don't realize that, he's really focused on these clerkly, these educational skills, right? He talks about the very material process of folding up the commission. He has his father's signet ring, the seal, the state seal, so that allows him to reseal it. So in those kinds of the detail of those processes, I'm wondering about these social workers. Is there something in the bureaucratic processes of their job that protects their conscience, right? That protects them from thinking about how devastating it will be, how tragic it will be for them not to see through or beyond the bureaucratic processes. In terms of the students, what I think is interesting, where you are right now, just thinking about how you're being shaped, how you're being educated, how you're being socialized. Like, when you have that experience that you just have way too much to do, right? and you just want a rubric and a checklist just so you can continue to move on. That actually, I think, feeds into developing you in, let's say, non-critical, potentially unethical ways, because it becomes just about the task itself and not the potential meaningfulness of what you're actually doing. So I often get into trouble when I focus so much, and I see Leah smiling here, I get into so much trouble when I focus my students on just an unstructured exercise of just reading a passage, right? And it's like, this is way too slow, it's too deep, it's too involved. And I'm saying that's precisely the skill that we need to work on developing to, in some ways, guard ourselves against just accepting the unethical issues or processes that we might encounter. That in some ways, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but it's like we will inevitably find ourselves in these kinds of situations. And I'm not saying that we have to do something, but I'd like for us to at least be positioned to see what's going on, right? And that is a step, right? I'm reminded of a quote, and I think Noam Chomsky in one of his essays on, believe it or not, election integrity in a South American country, and he was identifying the problem of the educational system in one of these poll observers, and how the education, as he identified, was teaching him. And I always mix this up, but the spirit of it is the education basically prepared him to look but not see. And that is the consequence of that unethical bureaucratic orientation to education. It teaches us to look but not see. So I'd like for the students to be conscious of those times or those experiences where they just don't have the time because they're just caught up into this overscheduling and the bureaucratic processes or tasks within that may eventuate for you in a passing grade. But what does that grade really mean? What do you understand about what you've engaged in? Does it position you to be, if not an ethically oriented citizen, positioned to act? At least you should be positioned, I would think, to see more ethically the various processes that define us, that either enable us to engage in just action or prevent us from engaging in just action. So that was a way I think, in terms of for the students specifically, to understand what I think Hamlet is demonstrating for us is when you divorce thought from education, you can do anything. And that's what Eichmann, according to Hannah Arendt, that's what Eichmann represents. It's thoughtlessness is, in a sense, and I may be overstating this, thoughtlessness, that bureaucratic thoughtlessness is infinitely more dangerous than some dictatorial madman, right? Because, any evil person requires a vast bureaucracy of thoughtless people, or thoughtless or frightened people to carry through or to carry out an evil plan. But I feel as if I'm talking too much. So someone else, please jump in.
I had a thought.
Yes.
I was going exactly the same places as your mind was with the rubric. Definitely. There are times when I have even felt that I have given a better grade to a worse paper because of my own rubric. But then, you think about, well, why do we have rubrics? And I agree with you completely that this teaches us to prize the wrong thing in our educations. We have the rubrics to compensate for unconscious and in some cases intentional bias. We have the rubrics to keep ourselves accountable, so the students as a communication tool, as a teaching tool. And so I think I might draw this dichotomy a little bit more kindly to rules than you have, without at all arguing that the dangers that you're pointing out aren't there. And maybe think of it in terms of Aristotle's distinction between law and equity, right? Law is having rules written down that we follow time and again, and those serve functions that are anywhere from teaching functions to sometimes you have a bad judge, and in that case it's better to have a good rule than to have a bad judge and no rule. But that also, rules will never apply to situations perfectly, because man is not capable of articulating rules that apply to the variety of human circumstances perfectly. And so equity is the correction of rule in the particular instance with justice or some other excellence in mind. In the case of law, it would be justice. And the other, so that might be one way to think of this as like, it's the things that you are both bringing up are potentially radical, but when they are combined with an eye to the potential benefit of rule, then a rule of law, then there is this kind of cost benefit analysis that one undergoes, right? And if an 8-year-old's life is at stake, then you break the rule. Maybe even if you're a cop and you have to break the Fifth Amendment to save a child's life, maybe you do it and you lose your job, and at the end of the day, you've done the right thing and you go home happy. But that also the rules do to some extent benefit us, and I don't think we truly wish to live in a ruleless society, nor do I think that's what anyone is saying. But that if you put those two together, then there's a way of looking and seeing that are keeping each other in check.
Right. But as you're describing as a dynamic process, that makes it an incredibly thoughtful process.
Yes.
And so it's when we worship a set of rules or laws thoughtlessly, that's when we run into trouble, right? And I'm thinking about what motivates or what propels that. Whether it's a matter of early formative socialization, or maybe it's after a process of education or socialization of defined by kind of critical consciousness. Then it's like, so is there a way that the threat of violence or of some sort of devastating consequence comes in? So it might be a process of people actually people socialized or educated just to be thoughtless bureaucrats in that regard, that would enable the establishment and perpetuation of devastatingly unjust society. Or it's perhaps people who have that critical consciousness, however whatever that experience or process before an oppressive institution comes in, and then it's through in some ways a campaign of fear, right? Of fear of the threat of violence. So the latter. So after an education of critical consciousness and the kind of threat of violence and of fear, that is a more complicated psychological state. And I think that why, as I'm thinking about this, Orwell's 1984 is coming to mind, because in some ways that is a dystopian kind of authoritarian society in transition. It's in the process through narrowing the range of critical subversive possibilities, but the goal is to ultimately just reduce any kind of nuance in its population. And so I think for many of us, and perhaps as I'm getting older, I experience this as a generational thing, that is the differences in my formative education from what I'm assessing with my students' education. And it's, in other words, my students have been, their education have been defined infinitely more by testing and assessment than my education. So I feel as if they enter into my class with certain testing and assessment expectations, and I'm trying to focus them on critical engagement with the text based on just the questions. But I think that in basing a pedagogy on those questions, it makes possible, or it even triggers that kind of critical engagement with rules and law. And I'm not exactly sure about the binary between the two, but it's rules and laws, and whatever the concept of justice is a continuing, ongoing, dynamic process. And I think that's what Eichmann represented for Arendt, And I think what Hamlet is illustrating in that passage is the thoughtlessness and the consequences to thoughtlessness. So
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think the psychology, you're describing it too, because it is infinitely more difficult to be aware of truth and goodness and beauty and love, and yet be self-moderated, than it is to either be completely moderated and unaware of goodness, truth, beauty, and so on. Yeah. Or you can be passionate about everything and have no self-moderation, like say Richard, he's really passionate about himself. He has no self-control. So like those two poles are actually relatively easy and relatively evil. Put the two together, and it's a very difficult thing. It is a difficult thing to tell a student, I see some quality here that is lacking that I cannot fit into a rubric. And it is difficult for the student to accept that.
Right. Somehow I hear in what you're saying an argument for majoring in English literature.
And philosophy.
And philosophy too, yes, exactly.
And that law should never be pursued without the other two.
Right, exactly. So a double major is what we're advocating in philosophy and in literature.
A genuine liberal arts education.
Right, and I think that's what you're saying. That's what you're getting at. That because literature is defined by that nuance and that complexity that is impossible. So it's the reason we continue to study literature is because it just doesn't fit into. Because if any literary text fit into a rubric, then there would be really no reason to continue to study it.
I think that's why Shakespeare is ultimately so useful from like a social sciences perspective, which is maybe not a very artistic way of putting it, but he somehow manages to represent the complexity of life in a way that no one can ever own him, right? So we can all walk into Shakespeare and we can see perspectives we haven't seen, but we also, if we have different political or theological or philosophical or artistic worldviews, we can argue Shakespeare at each other the same way we can argue the real world at each other. And that to me is why when I think of the English language, I have a hard time thinking of anybody who challenges Shakespeare.
Right. And as you're pointing out, I think that would be, it'd be so useful for us. And again, as advocating for literature and philosophy, because right now we exist in this world with this forced political tribalism, or let's say call it just an interpretive tribalism. It's either or. And everything about my training as a literary scholar teaches me to be incredibly suspicious of those attempts just to create or just to impose those kinds of binaries. And if we bring to the table that appreciation of that nuance, that diversity, and that complexity, it increases the chances that however it is we engage in those kinds of conversations to define or to determine what justice is or what it should be within this particular social, political, historical context, that it will meet the needs of a broader, let's say a more inclusive representation of the population. So what we're obviously talking about is the exact opposite of what Arendt identifies in someone like Eichmann, and it's Hamlet is throughout the play. He's defined by this inability to make specific ethical, moral conclusions and to act. So his way out of that is a kind of a religious thoughtlessness, right? And so that's precisely because a quasi-religious thoughtlessness is the stuff of political tribalism, right? So we want to avoid that, but then that leaves us with that question again. I'm not trying to force or to encourage folks to be to engage in radical, potentially consequential actions or anything, but at least it would bring us to the point where we recognize the complexity of our system and the difficulty of if not making moral decisions, of acting on those moral decisions.
I think.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just thinking that like part of the whole thing is that we need to become aware when we're completing things mindless, not so much that we have to stop completing that task so much as just we have to realize when it is that we're completing tasks mindlessly and figure out why we're completing it mindlessly, and whether, like I believe in Hamlet's case, it started off with like that fighting in his heart that wouldn't let him sleep. There was like this moral unsettling that was bothering him, and there was this distress in him that led him to behaving mindlessly. So then it comes to this point of why are we completing this task? And if we are completing this task, why is it mindless? If we are completing it mindlessly, are we trying to distract ourselves from some moral distress? And then if there is, we have to just become aware of it more than even like not do the task, but just becoming aware of where this mindlessness or where the distress is coming from, and whether or not we feel we need to address that moral distress. And I just think that that his defining point was when he decided that there was this moral distress keeping him sleeping, he was going to become bureaucratic about it and just be rash about it and not think it through so much as just act. And I think that was kind of like his defining moment, and where we can kind of like, I don't want to say learn, but like we need to focus on like what is creating the rashness? Is it just emotion? And is it just this moral distress? And that we need to focus on that moral distress. We have to go through it, kind of actually think it through, and that becoming critically aware of the distress is more the point than actually like being radical or being void or like not completing tasks. I just think that's what strikes me as important in this text.
That kind of reminded me when you said like, why are we being mindless, like questioning yourself. That kind of reminded me of like in high school when I just hated high school. Like
it sounds like you're reliving that hate right now.
Yeah, like, and it was like, because I just remember, especially, it was like really like, I would just sit there and I just felt like I was wasting time. Like honestly, I was like, why am I here? Like, I'm telling ya. And when I look back at it, I really feel like going to normal school, it felt like they were just training us to have a 9-to-5 job. Like, that's what it felt like. And the classes that I truly like knew that my teachers were trying to get us to have conversation and critical think that I genuinely loved, like I was like, yes, like I love this class, was my AP Human Geography class, which is where I had real conversations like I do in college. Like, it was very conversational. Like, we talked about politics, we talked about the world, and that was like my sophomore year, and I just freaking loved that class. I had like a C in the class the whole time. I did not care. Like, I just wanted, like, I loved that class, and I knew like everyone, we talked about everything like we do in our class. Like, it was like a very college level class, and I knew that was possible for high school students to have every class like that, whether it was AP or not. Like, every class should have been conversational like that. But you know, when it's at like city level like that, they only care about test scores, and that's how a school gets more money, you know. And the only other classes I really loved were like were my English classes, but they were specific English classes at different years where they were conversational, which was my junior year. We read a lot of Gatsby and we read God, what else? We read, what was it called? It was about like witchcraft and stuff like that. God, I can't even remember it anymore, but she actually like had conversations about it, and we analyzed it, and it was like Gothic literature, and like she really like went in and had like professors from colleges like come in and like talk to us, and like it was super conversational. So like the classes like that, that's when I realized I wasn't like a test taker. I was like, I had more depth to my intelligence. And then that's when I realized, you know, like, even though I had friends who were going to like Notre Dame and stuff like that, and they were in like UVA and stuff, and who were super good at test taking. I freaking sucked at the SAT, didn't even break 1,000. I was like in the 900s, and I was like, I literally went up to my mom and I was like, am I stupid? I was like, Mom, I think I'm stupid. And she was like, you're not stupid. Like, she's like, you're not stupid. And that's when I realized, like, this is my intelligence. Like I love having like the conversation, and like, but this is how it, like, those teachers in those higher up classes were like trying to get those good test takers to do this. And I just, like, in high school, like, it was just the reason why I wasn't good at tests is because I also didn't try to apply myself, because I was just so like bored. Like, my brain was like, this is just so, like, not even, was that even good for your brain? Like, am I even going to remember this? Like, is this even worth it? Like, am I going to remember that? Like, you know, like, am I going to remember this question? It just really was so like a waste of time. I remember sitting there, and like, if you finished your work, it was like they give you like a word search to do. Even if you're like in an honors class for something, it's like, are you serious? Like, what am I doing? I wish I went to, like, I honestly wish, if I could do it over again, I wish I graduated early, and I wish I went to like art school or like something for like the arts of, like, not like painting or anything, but more of like for literature, or like like a class or something before I went to college, you know what I mean? Because I loved that stuff so much, and I wish there was options, like, you know how people like do like the art schools while they're in high school and stuff. I wish there was something like that for kids who really liked literature. So like after school, or like if you graduated early, instead of going to like TCC or something, like there was like a legitimate I don't know, like club or something that you could go to. I just wish I went to something else besides like sitting there like just hating my life.
So it sounds to me what you're describing is just as you describe yourself as very creative and artistic in your orientation, and I feel as if built into that is some sort of ethical, some kind of passion or ethical purpose in what you do. And then so if you're in a system or defined within a system that the purpose is just to succeed within the system, but that isn't sufficiently inspirational or motivational to you. So, and my question is, how if we have any like educational historians in the audience, is how is it that we've reached this point where we've become so obsessed with testing and assessment that there is very little time devoted to that, to very little time devoted or an opportunity for really reflecting on what is the purpose. And it doesn't have to be one purpose, but what are perhaps the purposes of an education beyond just the completion of a rigidly structured course of study to then enter into the job market. So, I mean, I think that's for you, especially for students, that's a very legitimate question. And there might not be the kind of perspective on it, because I think your generation or the past couple of generations have been, I think, almost fully educated on one or another kind of federally mandated testing or assessment initiative. And I know at least one of my colleagues who just published a book, Thinking Like Shakespeare, arguing for the liberal arts approach to education. It's something that that a lot of professors of a certain generation are identifying in their students as representing this difference in the students' understanding of education, and their orientation to the education. And I guess to think of it in the terms that we've explored today, it's like they're seeing the ways in which our students are educated to be bureaucrats. And it's not to say that a bureaucratic functioning may not is bad in and of itself, and it may be a part of your work life. But in some ways, it's not reflective of what for a long time was defined as or counted as an education. And so again, I'm just referencing our talking about a liberal arts education in the way, Bella, that you described in terms of what motivated you, what inspired you. So again, I think that's in some ways a very basic question for you. That is for our students to ask. It's like, how did we get here? Why is there such an obsession over the things that don't necessarily reflect a quality education? And if there's something, if I'm not feeling it, and I almost mean literally, if I'm not feeling emotionally the education, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's something wrong with me. So Bella, no, you're not stupid, right? It's not something wrong with me. There might actually be something wrong with the system that's trying to force me to accept this as the sum total of an education.
If you think about it, it's actually even sadder than when it's successful than when it produces something like the education you just described. Because when it's successful, the individual actually doesn't know. They actually don't know what it is that they don't know. Right. And I'm sure you see them, and I'm sure you all see them around you in class, right? It's almost like they've been maimed. And I actually feel very moved on this topic because, you try to communicate with them, you try to reach out, you watch the classmates doing it. And I feel like it's a creature that's had a limb cut off during its childhood. And because I feel like whatever natural impetus the human creature has towards this has been trained out of them in a very 1984 Brave New World kind of way. And so it's not just that they, there's the idea that that Americans are not exposed to a wide enough array of richness in their upbringing. But it's not just that. It's that they've actually been penalized for that impulse. And some of them fight back, as you have done. And then hopefully there's at least a few college professors who reach out the hand to you, or you find other good people to talk to good stuff about, right? But others, like, that training is successful in, and that is terrifying and horrible, and yeah, that is something that I've been struggling to articulate since I became a professor, and it shocks me.
I've experienced it in a different system in a different country, right? In other words, a longer history than the educational history we have here of this very deep, bureaucratic, colonial approach to education. And the way that I experienced it is it's just so sad. It's really sad that you see students bursting with this incredible potential, and it's just been so crushed by the demands or the requirements of that system. And I would have to in some ways tease them into just really buying into or embracing this approach to education. Let's say a kind of a liberated approach to education, and they had already experienced the devastating consequences of doing so. So, in other words, I've seen in other places the future, I think, of American education in that regard, and we really don't want to go there, right? So the question for us is, how do we resist? How do we don't have time? We're actually down to 1 minute, but I think we should continue to talk about this and think seriously about a system that does not exist, to really tap into that potentiality, that creativity, that purpose that Bella identified. So we just ran out of time. Any parting words from anyone?
Can I just say, I read a lot of symbolic interactionism in sociology, and I would just like to say that not to give too much power to the organization and the institutions and the structures, because we actually built them through our own interactions, and those same interactions are the ones that will change them. And it looks like you can't, and it looks like it's too big, but to put those institutions as outside of our own making, that's very dangerous for that, and the kind of thing that you want to do, because what could you say if it's totally outside of us? Right. So this was just the best. And what's the next step is what I want to know. When are we going to meet again?
I believe the next meeting is December 3rd, and we'll.
It is.
Yes, and
yes.
we will be discussing Othello and the tragedy of racial self-hatred. That's the next one. But we can, if we want, devote some of that time, and maybe there will be a point of connection between the two, continuing this conversation as we then transition to discussing Othello in terms of racial self-hatred. Thank you so very much, everyone. Great talk. Have a great weekend.
Lovely job, Leah.
I enjoyed this talk.
Thank you.
Great.